3 days after my wife passed away, my son came to take the ownership papers for the yacht and spoke as if he truly cared about me. "Dad, I'm taking the boat in for maintenance before the weather gets bad. While I'm at it, I'll take my wife away for a few days. You should stay home and get some rest." He thought that excuse would be enough to fool me. But he didn't know my wife had quietly left me a warning, a secret key and a trap powerful enough to destroy everything they were trying to steal from me. One thing before we start: certain elements of this story were crafted to serve the telling. Names and places are coincidental, but the lesson at the heart of it belongs to all of us. They told me the service was beautiful. Reverend Burchard said those exact words when he gripped my hand at the door of St. Catherine's. "Russell, it was truly beautiful." I nodded and gave my thanks the way a man thanks someone for a meal he never tasted. 42 years I had spent beside Dorothea Callahan. Welcome to Father's silent revenge. I'm glad you're here with me today. If this is your first time, I hope you'll stay close. There are more stories like this one waiting for you, and every one of them matters. Before we go any further, let me ask you something. Honest, have you ever had someone you loved betray your trust in a way you never saw coming? Drop a yes or a no in the comments. I'd genuinely like to know. One more thing before we begin: some elements of this story have been shaped for the purposes of audio storytelling. Any resemblance to specific real people or events is coincidental. It's the meaning underneath that I want you to carry with you. And now people were pressing casseroles into my hands and telling me the funeral was beautiful, as if beauty had any bearing on what I was carrying inside, standing there in my good shoes on a Tuesday morning in May. The drive back to Astoria took 20 minutes. Colin rode with me. Renee followed in their car. My son sat in the passenger seat, hands folded quietly in his lap. For most of that drive, he kept his gaze on the coast out the side window. The Pacific was rough that morning, whitecaps driving hard toward shore. The kind of sea Dorothea always said looked angry. "You doing okay, Dad?" Colin asked somewhere past the lighthouse. "I'm upright," I said. He nodded as though that were a complete answer. When we turned into the driveway, the house looked wrong to me. Not changed, just wrong. The way a familiar face goes strange when you've been staring at it a beat too long. Dorothea's garden was still there along the front porch. The purple irises she planted the year Luca was born. The potted rosemary she'd been nursing back from near death for 2 seasons. All of it still alive and growing, indifferent to the fact that she was not. People came back to the house after the service. Neighbors, colleagues from the school where Dorothea had taught for 22 years, a few old friends from the harbor community. They filled the living room and spilled into the kitchen, and someone had laid out a table of food I had no memory of agreeing to, and voices were everywhere saying her name in past tense. I stayed near the fireplace for most of it. That's when I first noticed it, the thing that dropped a small, cold stone into my chest that afternoon and never quite left. I was watching Colin from across the room. He was doing everything right, shaking hands, receiving condolences, saying she would have wanted everyone to celebrate her life. He said as much to the third person who offered their sympathies. But every few minutes his eyes drifted, not toward the framed photographs of Dorothea on the mantel, not toward his son Luca, who sat in the corner with red eyes and a plate of food he wasn't touching. Colin's gaze kept finding the window at the back of the living room, the one that looked straight out over the rear yard and down to the dock where the marigold was sitting in the water. He watched that window the way a man watches his phone when he's expecting word of something important. When the last of the guests finally cleared out around 4:00, Pete Darnell stayed behind to help carry empty dishes to the kitchen. Pete had been my closest friend for 35 years. We'd worked together on commercial vessels out of Astoria before I opened the repair yard, and he'd been present at every significant moment in my life since. He was a big man, going gray, retired Coast Guard, with the kind of quiet that felt earned rather than empty. "Go on down," Pete said, nodding toward the dock. "I'll finish up in here." I walked out through the back door and across the yard to the water. The Marigold was a 1963 Matthews motor yacht, 42 FT wooden hull, fully restored, across 20 years of weekends and early mornings. Dorothea and I had bought her for $11,000 in 1988 from an estate sale in Ilwaco. There wasn't a single inch of her I hadn't touched with my own hands. The teak deck, the brass fittings, the engine I'd rebuilt twice. She was the kind of boat that made dock workers stop and look. I stepped aboard and stood in the cockpit a while without moving, one hand resting on the cabin door. The wood was warm from the afternoon sun. Somewhere behind me a gull called once and went quiet. "Pete's right," I said out loud to nobody. "She loves this boat." I meant it in present tense. I wasn't ready for past tense yet. I ducked into the cabin. It smelled the way it always smelled, teak oil salt and something faintly like the paperback novels Dorothea used to read out here on summer afternoons. I sat on the bench seat and pressed both palms flat against the table just to feel something solid. That's when I saw it. Wedged between the wall and the seat cushion, nearly invisible, a small white envelope with Dorothea's handwriting on the front. Just 3 words. "For Russell. Not yet." My hands went still. I knew that handwriting the way I knew this boat's engine sounds. By memory, by feel, by something that ran deeper than recognition. She had written it recently. The ink was still sharp. I picked it up, turned it over, set it back down on the table. My throat locked up so fast it startled me. I pressed my knuckles hard against my mouth and sat there breathing through my nose, staring at that envelope until the shaking in my chest slowed enough that I trusted myself to move. I slipped the envelope into my inside jacket pocket. When I climbed back up to the dock, the sun was dropping toward the tree line. I crossed the yard toward the house and was nearly to the back door when something pulled me up short. The window in my study, the narrow one that faced the side yard, was open. Not wide, maybe 2 inches. The kind of gap you'd leave to let air in, or if you'd been interrupted before you could close it properly. I stood there looking at it for a long moment. I had shut every window in that house before we left for the church that morning. Dorothea always fretted about rain blowing in off the bay, and the habit had worn itself so deep into me by now that I did it without thinking. 2 inches open. I went inside to check. The study looked undisturbed at first glance, but I am a mechanic. I've spent 40 years diagnosing problems that don't announce themselves. A diesel engine running 2 degrees hot. A hull seam taking on water too slowly to notice until it's far too late. You learn to read the small signs because the small signs are usually the honest ones. I moved through the room slowly, the way I'd walk a vessel I was surveying for the first time. The desk was clear. The bookshelf was arranged the way Dorothea had organized it. The 2-drawer file cabinet in the corner, the gray metal one I'd owned since before we bought the house, was closed, but the lock button on the top drawer was pushed in. I never locked that cabinet. The lock had been broken for years, and I'd never bothered with it. The button didn't do anything. It just sat there, sprung inward the way it stayed when someone pressed it without knowing it was decorative. I pulled the top drawer open. The files were all there. Property records, insurance documents, the old log books from my commercial days, and the folder at the back, the blue one where I kept everything related to the Marigold. Registration, maintenance records, the original bill of sale from the Ilwaco estate. I lifted the blue folder and spread it open on the desk. The maintenance logs were there. The insurance certificate was there. The bill of sale from 1988 was there. Dorothea's signature beside mine in her careful teacher's handwriting. The original registration, Oregon State Marine Board certificate of title, dated October 14, 1988, was gone. I stood at that desk for a long time. My jaw was tight, the kind of tight that sets in when your mind is running faster than your face can follow. Someone had come into my house on the day of my wife's funeral and taken the title to my boat. I was still standing there when I heard Colin's car pull into the driveway. He and Renee had come back. I'd half expected it the way you half expect rain when the sky turns yellow in the afternoon. Renee came in through the back door first, carrying a container of food. She was 38, dark-haired, dressed with a precision that always made her look as though she were attending something slightly more important than wherever she actually stood. She had a way of entering a room that called to mind the real estate listings she ran. Everything arranged for maximum effect. "Dad, I brought you some of Anna's chicken soup from the diner," she said, setting it on the counter. "You need to actually eat today." I ate at the service. "A few crackers don't count." She opened a cabinet, found a bowl, and began moving through my kitchen with the ease of someone who'd been here many times. "Colin's just locking up the car." I closed the blue folder and placed it back in the cabinet. I said nothing about the missing title. Colin came in a minute later, poured himself a coffee without asking, and settled at the kitchen table. He looked tired. There were lines around his eyes I'd been noticing more in the past year, the kind that come from bad sleep and real worry, not just age. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "I keep starting sentences in my head, and then realizing I'm about to say something to your mother," I said. "It's only been 2 days. I imagine that stops eventually." Colin looked down at his cup. Something moved across his face, something that looked like guilt, except I wasn't sure yet what he had to feel guilty about. Renee sat down across from me and folded her hands on the table. She had the kind of eyes that took in more than they gave back. "Dad," she said in the soft voice she used when she was about to deliver something she'd thought through in advance. "Have you given any thought to what you want to do with the house with the boat, just in terms of simplifying things now that it's just you?" The soup container sat between us, still warm. "Dorothea's been gone 2 days, Renee," I said. Her expression shifted at once into something shaped like concern. "Of course. I'm sorry. We want to make sure you're not carrying more than you need to. Emotionally, practically. All of it." "I've been carrying things for 69 years, I said. "I'm not looking to put anything down just yet." Colin reached over and touched Renee's arm, a small gesture, quick. She picked up her coffee and said nothing more about it, but I had felt it. The way you feel a draft without seeing where it gets in. That afternoon after they left, I called Pete. Pete Darnell, my oldest friend, retired Coast Guard, the man who had stood beside me through every hard thing since 1989, picked up on the second ring. "How are you doing, Russ?" he said. "I need to ask you something," I said. "This past week, has anyone been around the dock? Anyone you didn't recognize?" A pause. "Why are you asking? Just answer me first." Another pause, longer this time. I could hear wind on his end. He was down at the harbor, probably. Pete was almost always down at the harbor. "Day before yesterday," he said. "A man came by, maybe 50 years old. Nice jacket, not a dock person. Walked around the Marigold for about 10 minutes. I figured he was just admiring her at first, but then he started taking pictures, detail shots, the hull, the stern, the cockpit, combing, and he asked me about her restoration history. Specifically wanted to know who did the woodwork, what year the engine was rebuilt, whether the original fittings had been preserved." My hand tightened around the phone. "He give you a name?" I asked. "Said he was just passing through." "Didn't buy it." Pete's voice dropped half a register. "Russ, that man was a professional appraiser. I've watched enough estate work over the years to recognize what that looks like. Someone hired him." I stood at the kitchen window, and looked out at the dock. The marigold sat in the afternoon shadow patient, and still the way she always was. "Pete," I said, "Dorothea's title certificate is gone. Somebody pulled it from my files. Probably today while we were all at the service." The silence that followed had weight to it. "Russ." Pete's voice was careful now, the way it got when something serious was unfolding, and he needed me to hear him clearly. "Tell me you're not going to let this go." I thought about Renee's hands folded on the table. I thought about Colin's eyes drifting to the window at the funeral. I thought about the envelope in my jacket pocket that I still hadn't opened. "I'm not going to let it go," I said. I hung up and stood in my kitchen in the quiet of the house where Dorothea wasn't anymore. And I understood with the particular clarity that comes from grief and mechanical training and 42 years of paying attention that whatever was beginning here had started before she was even cold. A mechanic doesn't rush a diagnosis. You observe first. You let the problem show itself fully before you touch anything. I had spent 40 years learning that lesson on engines, and I was applying it now to my own life. 2 weeks after the funeral, I was sanding the stem of a client's skiff outside the yard when I heard footsteps on the dock that didn't belong to anyone I knew. The sound was wrong too. Deliberate too, measured like someone walking a property line rather than simply moving through a working marina. I set down the sandpaper and looked up. The man was around 50, wearing a jacket that cost more than most of the boats in my yard. He stood at the end of the dock studying the marigold the way an appraiser studies a house before he writes a number systematically, starting at the waterline, working upward. I walked over. "Help you with something?" I said. He turned with the easy smile of someone accustomed to controlling conversations. "Beautiful vessel. She a trumpy." "She is," I said. "And she's not for sale." He tilted his head slightly, as if I'd said something mildly surprising. "I was told she might be coming available soon." Must have been a miscommunication. Every muscle in my back went rigid. I kept my voice level. "Hakita, who told you that?" "Oh, it came through a colleague," he said, waving his hand in the vague way people do when they'd rather not give a straight answer. "These things get around. The restoration market for wooden hulls is very active right now." "If you ever reconsider, I won't," I said. "Have a good day." He handed me a card anyway. I didn't look at it until he was gone. Pacific Crest Vessel Acquisition Specialist. I turned it over. Nothing on the back. I slid it into my shirt pocket and stood there with my jaw so tight, my back teeth ached. Someone had already told a buyer the boat was coming available. Someone had done that before I'd agreed to anything, before I'd even been asked. I was still standing there when Pete came out of the tool shed wiping grease off his hands. "Same type as the one who came around last week?" I asked. Pete squinted after the departing figure. "Different man, same energy." He tossed the rag over his shoulder. "Russ, I've been thinking about this. Somebody's building a picture of that boat's value, appraisers, buyers, people asking questions. That's not curiosity. That's a transaction getting ready to happen." "Without my knowledge," I said. "Without your knowledge." Pete agreed, and the lines around his eyes deepened. "You need to start thinking about who has the most to gain here, and how far they're willing to go." That evening, Colin came by alone. No Renee. He sat across from me at the kitchen table with a folder I didn't recognize. "Dad, I've been doing some research." He started, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone who had rehearsed the opening lines. "There are some really excellent places near Portland, assisted living communities they're calling them now. Not nursing homes, more like Colin." My voice came out harder than I intended, and I watched him flinch. "Your mother has been gone 3 weeks. I know. I know that, Dad. He leaned forward, and I could see something genuine in his face. Whether it was real concern or a practiced version of it, I couldn't tell anymore. But you're here alone in this house. You're running yard by yourself. And frankly what? He pressed his lips together. Frankly, you're 69 years old, and you just lost your wife, and I'm worried about you. I looked at my son, really looked at him across that kitchen table. The lines around his eyes, the set of his shoulders. 43 years old, and something in him was pulled tight as a cable under load. "What's the name of the place?" I asked. He slid the brochure across to me. I picked it up. The photograph showed smiling elderly people in sunlit common rooms, beautiful grounds. On the back, a name I didn't recognize, and in the lower right corner printed small Dorian Fitch Estate and Conservatorship Law, Portland, Oregon. A lawyer's name on an assisted living brochure. "I'll think about it," I said. Colin's shoulders dropped half an inch with something that looked like relief, and that half inch told me everything I needed to know about what this visit had really been about. After he left, I sat at the table for a long time. My chest felt heavy in a way that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with recognition. I thought about the man with the acquisition specialist card. I thought about the missing title. I thought about Renee's folded hands, and Colin's rehearsed concern, and a lawyer's name printed on a brochure for an assisted living facility. Then I picked up my phone and called a number I hadn't dialed in almost a year. Floyd Mabry answered on the third ring. Floyd was 63, retired, living up in Astoria. We'd served together on commercial vessels out of Portland for nearly a decade in the 80s, and there wasn't a man alive I trusted more to keep his mouth shut and do exactly what he said he'd do. "Russ," he said with the warmth of someone genuinely glad to hear a voice. "How are you holding up? I heard about Dorothea." "I'm so sorry." My throat tightened. I breathed through it. "I'm managing Floyd. Thank you." I paused. "I might need a favor sometime in the coming months. Nothing illegal, but something that requires discretion and someone I can count on." A beat of quiet. "Then, name it, Russ. Whatever you need. I'll be in touch," I said. "Just wanted to make sure you were still in the area." "Nowhere else I'd be," Floyd said. I hung up, walked back to the dock in the last of the evening light, and stood with my hand on the Marigold's rail. The bay was flat and darkening, and the navigation lights on the far shore were just starting to appear. I needed to know what Dorothea had actually left behind. Not the furniture, not the savings account, not the garden she'd tended along the front porch. I needed to know whether she had seen this coming. And there was only one person who could tell me that. I went inside, found Gerald Ashford's number in my contacts, and made the call. Gerald Ashford's office smelled like old wood and cold coffee, the same as it had for the 20 years he'd handled the Callahan family's legal work. He was 68, lean, with the kind of face that gave nothing away for free. Every expression earned, every word placed with the care of a man who understood that language was a precision tool. He was already spreading documents across his desk when I walked in. "Sit down, Russell," he said, without looking up. "There's quite a bit to cover." I sat. "You said on the phone that Dorothea left something." "She left several things." Gerald finally looked up, and there was something in his eyes I hadn't seen from him before. Not quite sympathy, but close to it. "Before I show you any of it, I need you to understand something. Everything Dorothea did, she did with full legal authority and complete mental clarity. She was methodical about this, more methodical than most clients half her age." My chest contracted. How long had she been planning it? "She first came to see me alone without you in January of this year. Gerald folded his hands on the desk. 4 months before she passed. The air went out of the room. January, while she was still teaching her adult literacy class on Thursday evenings, while we were still having breakfast together every morning and arguing about which radio station to play. "And she never told me," I said, and my voice came out rougher than I intended. "She asked me to keep it between us. She was very specific about that." Gerald slid a folder across the desk. Russell Dorothea had what's called a separate revocable trust, a legal document that stands entirely in her name, independent from your joint assets. Under Oregon law, a married person can establish and modify a separate trust without their spouse's signature or knowledge. It is completely legal. She exercised that right. I looked at the folder, but didn't open it yet. "What does it cover?" "The Marigold, primarily, along with her personal savings account, her retirement fund from the school district, and several sentimental items she specifically named." Gerald leaned forward slightly. "She amended the trust 9 days before she died. That amendment included a provision I need to explain to you carefully." "Go ahead," I said. Gerald took a breath. "The trust contains what's called a morality clause, specifically a no contest and bad conduct provision. It states that if any named beneficiary attempts to manipulate, coerce, or defraud you in connection with trust assets, including forging your signature, pursuing legal guardianship under false pretenses, or facilitating the sale of the Marigold without your documented consent, that beneficiary automatically forfeits their inheritance rights." He paused. "I want to be precise here, Russell, because this matters legally. The clause does not activate on its own the moment someone does something wrong. It requires documented evidence of the violation to be submitted to the probate court, which then issues a formal ruling. What the clause does is give us a very strong legal basis to petition the court the moment we have that evidence. I've already prepared the filing. It's ready to submit." I sat with that for a moment. The legal precision of it, the patience it must have taken Dorothea to sit across from Gerald and think through every contingency while she was still fighting to stay alive. "She thought of everything," I said, and my voice cracked on the last word despite myself. Gerald's expression shifted barely, but I caught it. "She was a remarkable woman, Russell." I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth for a second, then straightened up. "Tell me about the Marigold specifically." "Under the trust terms, the Marigold cannot be sold during your lifetime without a written consent document bearing your signature, witnessed by 2 independent adults who are not beneficiaries. Additionally, any attempt to sell the vessel without that document is a direct trigger for the bad conduct provision." Gerald tapped the folder. "She didn't just protect the boat, she built a legal tripwire around it." My hands were trembling slightly. I put them flat on my thighs and pressed down. "Gerald," I said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me straight. If someone were trying to build a case that I was mentally incompetent, diminished capacity, unable to manage my own affairs, how difficult would that actually be?" Gerald looked at me steadily for a moment. Then he said, "It would require a licensed medical professional to conduct a cognitive evaluation and submit a report to the court. A lawyer, say, someone specializing in conservatorship, would then file a petition citing that report as grounds to appoint a guardian or conservator to manage your assets. The process typically takes several weeks from filing to hearing." He paused. "In Oregon, the standard for granting conservatorship is significant, but a well-prepared petition with medical documentation can move quickly through the court system if it's not contested." His voice dropped half a register. "Russell, do you have specific reason to be asking me this?" I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the brochure Colin had left. I slid it across the desk and pointed to the name in the lower right corner. Gerald looked at it. His jaw tightened. He looked up at me. "Dorian Fitch!" You know him. I know his work, Gerald said. And the way he said it made it sound like something he'd found on the bottom of his shoe. He operates entirely within the law. That's what makes him effective, and that's what makes him dangerous. He finds families with elderly relatives and significant assets and makes the legal system move in one direction. He slid the brochure back toward me. How did you come to have this? Colin brought it, suggested I consider moving to a facility near Portland. Gerald stared at me for a long moment. Then he stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the street below. When he turned back, something had shifted in his posture. The careful neutrality was gone, replaced by something harder. Russell, I want to be honest with you. What you're describing, the missing title, the unsolicited appraisals, the assisted living suggestion connected to Dorian Fitch's name, these are not coincidences. This is coordinated. He came back to the desk and leaned forward on both hands. The question is how much evidence we need before we act. And the answer is enough that when we do act, there's no room for them to maneuver. My throat felt like it was full of gravel. I cleared it. How do we get that evidence? Gerald picked up a pen and clicked it once. We let them show us exactly how far they're willing to go. He reached into his desk drawer and set a small white envelope on the desk beside the trust folder. Dorothea left this with me the last time she came in. She told me to give it to you when you were ready. He pushed it toward me. I think you're ready. I picked up the envelope. My name was on the front in Dorothea's handwriting, different from the one I'd found on the boat, but the same careful loops, the same deliberate pressure on the pen. I put it in my pocket next to the first one. Outside Gerald's window, the streets of Astoria were going about their ordinary business. People walking dogs, someone unloading groceries, a kid on a bike cutting the corner too fast. All of it unreasonably normal. Gerald, I said, standing up. Whatever they're planning, I want to be ready before they pull the trigger. Gerald looked at me with what I could only describe as quiet satisfaction. Then let's make sure we are. 3 days after I left Gerald's office, I called the security camera company. I want to be clear about this. The camera in my living room was not something I installed in secret. It had been there for 2 years, a standard home security unit mounted near the front window, the kind half the households in Astoria have now. Dorothea had wanted it after a break-in 2 streets over. I had activated the motion detection recording the morning after I found the title missing, and I had not mentioned it to Colin or Renee. There was no legal issue with recording inside my own home. I had simply stopped ignoring what was already there. So when Colin called that Thursday morning, I was ready. Dad, I set up a health check for you. He said, his voice carrying that particular careful warmth I had started to recognize as rehearsed. Just routine. Dr. Sylvia Keene, she's a neurologist out of Cannon Beach, very well regarded. I figured with everything you've been through, it made sense to have someone take a look. I pressed the phone a little tighter against my ear. A neurologist. Not a general practitioner, not a grief counselor, a neurologist for a man whose wife had just died. That's thoughtful of you, I said. Ba, what time? 10 hour shulanos tomorrow. I'll come by and Renee wants to be there too, just for support. Of course she does, I said. I'll put the coffee on. I called Gerald the moment I hung up. A neurologist named Sylvia Keene out of Cannon Beach, I said. Tomorrow at 10:00. Colin and Renee both coming. Gerald exhaled slowly. That's the medical evaluation step. They need a professional assessment on record before Fitch files anything substantial. A pause. Russell, how do you want to play this? I'm going to give them something to write down, I said. Not enough to be useful in court, just enough to make them think they're winning. Be careful, Gerald said. and his voice had a sharp edge to it. You give them one sentence that looks genuine, and Fitch will build a case around it. I've been reading engines for 40 years, Gerald. I know the difference between a miss and a stall. I heard something that might have been a quiet laugh. All right, I'll be near my phone. Dr. Sylvia Keene arrived at 9:45, 15 minutes early, which told me she had been briefed and was not operating on a casual schedule. She was 47, composed with the efficient manner of someone who had conducted hundreds of evaluations and knew exactly how they were supposed to go. She carried a leather portfolio and shook my hand with a firm professional grip. What she did not know was that Renee had arrived 20 minutes before her. I had been in my bedroom when Renee knocked. I came to the hallway, slowly moving the way a man might move if he were tired and a little unsteady, which was entirely for Renee's benefit, because she was watching from the moment she stepped inside. She and Dr. Keene spoke in the entryway for about 4 minutes before I came into the living room. I could hear them clearly from the hallway. He's been having some trouble keeping track of time. Renee kept her voice low and warm with false concern. Sometimes he talks as if Dorothea is still here. We're not sure if it's grief or something more serious. He gets confused about appointments, about what day it is. Has he had any episodes of disorientation? Dr. Keene asked. A few. Nothing dramatic, but enough that the family is concerned. I walked into the room with my coffee mug and a slight furrow in my brow, like a man interrupted mid-thought. Dr. Keene, I'm Russell. Sorry if I kept you waiting. The evaluation lasted 40 minutes. Dr. Keene asked me standard cognitive assessment questions, the date, the current president, to remember 3 objects, and repeat them after a delay to count backward from 100 by 7s. I answered most of them correctly. I got the day of the week wrong once, pausing just long enough to seem like I was searching for it. When she asked me to describe a recent memory in detail, I talked about a fishing trip Colin and I had taken in 2018, then stopped mid-sentence and said, I'm sorry I keep mixing up when things happened. Since Dorothea, everything feels like it's in the wrong order. Renee, sitting across the room, leaned forward slightly. I saw it without looking at her directly. Mr. Callahan, Dr. Keene said, writing something in her portfolio. Do you ever feel like you're not quite yourself? Difficulty concentrating, losing track of conversations? I looked out the window toward the dock for a long moment, let my eyes go a little distant, then turned back and said, After 42 years with the same woman, I suppose the whole world feels unfamiliar right now. Is that what you mean? Dr. Keene stopped writing. Something shifted in her face. Not much, but enough that I filed it away. When the evaluation ended, Colin walked Dr. Keene to her car. Renee stayed behind, gathering the coffee cups from the table with the air of someone doing a favor. I sat in my chair and let my eyes half close, performing exhaustion. The moment I heard Colin's voice outside, Renee took out her phone and began typing, rapidly, focused, precise, the tension in her shoulders, the tension of a person finishing a task, rather than comforting a grieving father-in-law. That night, I pulled up the camera footage and watched the entryway recording from 9:25. Renee coaching Dr. Sylvia Keene before the examination. 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Every word enough for a transcript. I called Gerald at 9:30. I've got her on camera, I said, and I could not keep the steel out of my voice. Renee told the doctor exactly what conclusions to reach before she ever walked in the door. Gerald went very quiet. Then save that recording to at least 2 separate locations tonight. Do not tell anyone else you have it. Already done, I said. Russell. His voice was measured, deliberate. They just handed us the first piece. Pete helped me install the GPS tracker 11 days before Colin came for the keys. It was a small unit, commercial grade, the kind marine salvage crews use to track vessels in disputed waters. Pete ordered it through a supply contact he still had from his Coast Guard years. We went down to the dock at 11 at night when the marina was quiet, and Pete slid it behind the engine compartment's rear access panel, bolted flush against the frame where it would take a trained mechanic specifically looking for it to find. I was the only trained mechanic Colin would ever let near that boat, and he wouldn't be asking me. "She'll ping every 10 minutes, Pete said, wiping his hands on a shop rag as we climbed back up to the dock. "Battery lasts 90 days. "That's all I'll need," I said. So when Colin's truck pulled into my driveway at 7:15 on a Wednesday morning, earlier than he had ever arrived unannounced in his adult life, I already knew what he was there for. I had made coffee. I was ready. He came through the back door with the kind of energy that happens when someone has been rehearsing their lines since before sunrise. "Morning, Dad." He poured himself a cup without being offered one, which he always used to do as a kid, and which I had always loved. That morning, it felt different. "I set something up. There's a wooden boat restoration specialist up in Ilwaco I've been talking to. Harborside Classic Marine. They do incredible work on vintage hulls, and I thought it'd be a good time to have the marigold properly gone over before the weather turns." I wrapped both hands around my mug and looked at him over the rim. "Harborside Classic Marine," I said. "In Ilwaco." "That's right." He met my eyes steadily. "I figured you'd want her in good shape." I had looked up Harborside Classic Marine 3 nights ago. The business had closed in 2018. Its owner had retired to Medford, Oregon. There was no phone number to call, no website, nothing but an archived local news article about a man who had spent 40 years restoring boats and was ready to stop. I set my mug down and walked to the kitchen drawer where I kept the spare boat key on a plain ring. I held it for just a moment, the brass worn smooth from years of use, the same key I had cut from the original at a hardware store on Highway 101 the year we brought the marigold home. Then I placed it in Colin's outstretched hand. "You'll make sure they take care of her," I said. Colin closed his fingers around the key, and something moved through his face. Relief, I thought, or maybe the relief of a man who expected more resistance and is not sure whether to be grateful or suspicious that he got none. "Of course, Dad. She'll come back better than she left." I walked him to the back door and watched him cross the yard to the dock. He moved with a purpose that had nothing to do with dropping a boat off for maintenance. He stepped aboard, started the engine, that deep, familiar rumble I could identify in my sleep, and eased the marigold out of the slip. I stood at the back door and watched my son take my boat. My fingers pressed into the doorframe hard enough to feel the grain biting into my skin. The burning behind my eyes had nothing to do with the light coming through the window. I simply refused to let it become something else. Dorothea's fingerprints were on every inch of that boat. 36 years of our life together were built into its hull, and I stood there watching it pull away because releasing it was the only way to build the case that had to be built. I turned around and went inside to open my laptop. The GPS dot was tracking north up the Oregon coast, not toward Ilwaco, but steadily up Highway 101 past Tillamook, holding a straight line toward the Washington state border. I picked up the phone and called Gerald. "It started," I told him. "Where is she?" Gerald asked right away. "Heading north. Washington bound, by the look of the trajectory. Not Ilwaco, not any repair yard." My voice was flat and controlled, the way it only gets when what you're actually feeling is too vast to let loose. "He's moving her toward a buyer." "Gerald, there's something else." His tone tightened at the edges. "I got a notice this morning from the probate court. Dorian Fitch filed a petition for conservatorship of your person and estate on Colin's behalf." The pause that followed landed like a blow. The filing date on the document is April 18, 2024. I kept my eyes on the GPS dot drifting north along the coastline. April 18th, 5 weeks before Dorothea passed. He filed it before she was even gone, I said. Yes. Gerald's voice was measured and deliberate. Russell, this was not born of grief. This was assembled ahead of time. My jaw went rigid. My grip on the phone went white. Every generous thought I'd ever extended to Colin, every doubt I'd swallowed, every excuse I'd made across 43 years caved in on itself like a building whose bones had long since rotted through. Gerald, I said when I could trust my voice to carry the words, and how much do you know about Dorian Fitch? The silence that came back wasn't empty. It was the silence of a man measuring exactly how much to hand over. More than I'd care to, Gerald said at last. And I've had my eye on him for some time now. Come in tomorrow morning, Russell. There's considerably more you need to hear. Gerald had papers spread across every surface of his desk when I came through the door. Not the orderly display of a lawyer walking a client through a case, this was the controlled chaos of someone who had been at it since well before daylight, cross-referencing, building something piece by piece. He looked up the moment I walked in and went straight to it. Dorian Fitch has been working conservatorship law in Oregon for 19 years, Gerald said, pulling a printed sheet from the top of the nearest pile. In that span, he has filed over 180 petitions. 151 of them were granted. He set the sheet down and held my gaze. That is not a success rate. That is a pattern. I drew out the chair across the desk and sat. What kind of pattern? The kind that never quite steps into criminal territory. Gerald rose from his seat and started moving around the desk, the way he always did when something was working at him, beneath the composed surface. Fitch targets families where an older person holds real assets, property, boats, investment accounts, business interests. He locates a family member with a financial stake. He walks them through the medical documentation process, the petition, the filing, the hearing prep. All of it carried out in a way that reads on paper like a devoted family member shielding a vulnerable elder. Until the assets are liquidated, I said. Until the assets are liquidated, Gerald echoed. By which point Fitch has already collected his fees, and if anything unravels legally, the family member absorbs the liability. He stopped at the window and turned back to face me. I've been tracking his cases for 3 years, Russell. I've never managed to get a former client to step forward. They're either too humiliated, too legally exposed, or they've genuinely convinced themselves they were acting out of love at the time. My hands tightened on the arms of the chair. How close is Colin's petition to being actionable? Closer than I'd like. Gerald returned to the desk and settled back into his seat. He has Dr. Keene's preliminary evaluation. He has filed the petition. The court has scheduled a hearing for September 15th. That gives us roughly 11 weeks. He paused. But here is the critical problem. If Fitch moves for emergency temporary conservatorship before the hearing, which he can do if he lays evidence before the court of immediate risk to your assets, a temporary guardian could be appointed within days. In that window, a sale could be executed before we successfully contest it. The room felt like it had shrunk since I sat down. So September isn't soon enough, I said. We need evidence strong enough to file a counter-petition and motion to dismiss before he forces the timeline forward. There was an urgency underneath Gerald's steady voice that he couldn't entirely keep from the surface. The living room footage is a solid beginning, but I need more, Russell. I need the medical fraud documented. I need financial misconduct documented. And I need to establish that Renee is not simply a worried daughter-in-law, but an active coordinating party in this scheme. I reached into my inside jacket pocket and pulled out the second envelope, the one Gerald had handed me at our last meeting, the one carrying Dorothea's handwriting, the one I still hadn't opened. I laid it on the desk between us. Before we go any further, I said, I need to read this. Gerald gave a single nod and said nothing, settling back in his chair. I opened the envelope with care. The way you handle something you know you can never put back together once it's open. Inside was a single sheet of Dorothea's school stationery, ivory colored with her initials at the top, the kind she'd used for 40 years of lesson plans and letters home to parents. Her handwriting was steady. She had not written this from a sickbed. Russell, if you're reading this, something went wrong that I couldn't fix before I left. Don't trust anyone who tells you to give up the boat. Don't trust anyone who tells you that you're not yourself. You are exactly yourself. That's what I've always loved about you. I'm sorry I didn't tell you everything sooner. I kept thinking I had more time. I love you. I always will. D. My chest locked up so fast and so hard that I had to press both palms flat against my thighs and force the air through my teeth. My eyes burned hot. I stared at the top of the page until the words held still. She knew I said, and the voice that came out barely sounded like mine. After everything I'd done to hold myself together, she had known the entire time and carried it by herself. Gerald leaned forward. His voice dropped to nearly nothing. She was trying to keep it from you until she'd built something solid enough to protect you after she was gone. I folded the letter along the crease it already carried and slid it back into the envelope. My hands weren't entirely steady doing it. I tucked it into my inside jacket pocket close to my chest, not something I'd normally do with a piece of paper, but the only thing that felt right in that moment. "All right," I said when I could speak clearly again. "What do you need from me?" "Keep the camera running, document everything." And Gerald paused for just a fraction of a second. "There's someone else you need to talk to. Pete Darnell." I looked up. "Pete knows something he's been keeping back. He's been holding something for you. Dorothea's instruction." Gerald held my eyes. She gave it to him specifically, because she knew it needed to come from someone you trusted completely at the right moment. I think that moment is now. I was at the dock before noon. Pete was coiling rope near the fuel station at the far end of the pier, working with the unhurried precision of a man who'd repeated the same motions 10,000 times. He saw me coming and set the rope down. "Gerald called you," I said. "About 20 minutes ago." Pete reached into the front pocket of his canvas work jacket and brought out a small object on a plain ring, a brass key, old, the kind cut for a padlock rather than a door. He held it toward me with the look of a man finally keeping a promise he'd been carrying for months. "She gave me this in February. Said, if Colin ever touches the boat, you give this to Russell." His voice went a little rough at the edges. "Said you'd know what it opens." I took the key from his palm. The brass had worn down to a soft gold from months spent in a jacket pocket. The moment the key sat between my fingers, I knew with complete and immediate certainty which lock it belonged to. The old wooden cabinet at the far end of the dock, sea green paint bleached raw by years of salt air. Dorothea and I had picked it up at an estate auction in Cannon Beach, the year we moved to Astoria. It had stood at the end of that dock for 38 years, holding fishing tackle and spare line, and in recent years, not much of anything. Renee had never once walked that far down the pier. The smell of engine oil and salt mud turned her stomach, and she'd made that plain on both occasions she'd come to the marina. Dorothea had known that. She had picked the spot with exactly that in mind. "Pete." My throat felt thick. "Did she tell you what was inside?" Pete shook his head. "She just said it was everything you'd need." He laid his hand briefly on my shoulder, a solid, wordless pressure that said more than most speeches could. "She trusted you, Russ. She built the whole thing on that." I closed my fist around the key. "There's one person I need to see first," I said. before I come back for that cabinet," Claudette Fairley Pete said right away. I looked at him. "Dorothea told me that too," he said. "Claudette's part of it. Go see her, Russ. Then come back." Claudette Fairley's bookstore occupied the stretch of Main Street in Astoria, between a hardware store and a coffee roaster, the kind of small business that had held on for 30 years on the strength of a devoted neighborhood and an owner who had actually read every title on the shelves. I had walked past that front window more times than I could count. I had never gone in by myself. The bell above the door announced me, and the smell reached me before anything else. Old paper and good coffee and something faintly like cedar. It was Dorothea's smell, the smell of her Saturday mornings at home. My throat locked up so fast and so hard that I had to stop just inside the entrance and grip the nearest shelf until it loosened. Claudette came out from behind the counter and took one look at me. She said with the gentle directness of someone who had been expecting this visit and had prepared herself for it. She was 64, sturdy, with silver hair cut short and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. "Come and sit down. I'll bring coffee." She set 2 mugs on the small table in the back corner, the one tucked between the local history section and the window that looked out over the alley. I sat. She sat across from me and folded her hands on the table, and her eyes carried the particular sadness of someone who had been holding something heavy for a long time. "How long did you know?" I asked. "She came to me in March," Claudette said. 2 months before she passed, she sat in that exact chair and told me she had a problem she needed help carrying. Claudette wrapped both hands around her mug, and the knuckles went slightly white. She said Renee was not who she appeared to be, and she needed someone outside the family to hold certain things in case something happened before she could sort it out herself. She didn't tell me. The words came out raw, more wounded than I'd meant to let show. Claudette held my gaze steadily. She told me why she didn't. She said if she told you, you'd confront Colin, and if you confronted Colin before she'd built enough protection around you, they would push their plans forward and you'd have nothing left to fight with. She reached across and briefly touched my hand. She was protecting you, Russell. Every choice she made came back to keeping you safe. I pressed my fingers hard against my eyes for a moment, pushing back the heat gathering behind them. Then I sat straight. "What did she leave you?" I asked. Claudette rose and went to the back office. She returned with a manila folder thick with documents and set it on the table between us. "Dorothea hired a private investigator named Arlo Tibbs," she said, settling back down. "He was a retired Astoria police detective who took on freelance work. She found him through a referral and paid him herself from her personal account without telling you or Gerald." Claudette paused. "Arlo suffered a stroke in April. He passed away April 29th, just 3 weeks before Dorothea." Her voice caught slightly on that. "Before he died, he mailed me a complete copy of his report. He told me over the phone that if anything happened to him before he could close the case, I should hold it and hand it to Russell when the moment came." I opened the folder. The report had the thoroughness that only comes from someone who spent decades working homicide and fraud. Arlo Tibbs had documented 2 previous marriages for Renee in San Diego in 2010 to a man named Gage Tilford, an architect who lost his condominium and his entire investment portfolio in the divorce proceedings 18 months later. The second in Seattle in 2016 to a man named Brent Holloway, a commercial real estate broker who lost the bulk of his business assets within 2 years of marrying her. In both cases, Tibbs had noted the same pattern. Renee had made initial contact with each man at professional events, had spent time studying their financial profiles before allowing the relationship to deepen, and had methodically cut them off from family members who voiced concern. At the bottom of his notes, Tibbs had written in plain block letters, pattern consistent with deliberate financial predation. Subject did not stumble into these situations. She selected them. I sat with those words for a long moment. My jaw ached from how hard I was holding it. She selected Colin, I said. She knew about the charter business before she ever introduced herself to him at that marina event in Portland. Claudette said it with tight, controlled anger in her voice. Dorothea believed she had mapped out your family's assets, the house, the boat, the property value before she ever shook your son's hand. My stomach turned in a way I hadn't felt since the early years out on rough water. Not fear, something worse than that. The sickening recognition that something terrible had been closing in on someone I loved, and I had never once seen it coming. Russell. Claudette leaned forward, her eyes fierce and warm at the same time. This report is not courtroom evidence. Arlo is gone, and a dead man's notes from a private investigation cannot be entered as testimony. But it is a map. It tells you exactly where to look, which records to pull, and which threads to tug on. She tapped the folder. Dorothea knew that. She said, "Give Russell the map. He'll know what to do with it." I closed the folder and held it with both hands. Through the window, Main Street, Astoria moved through its ordinary Tuesday afternoon. A delivery truck pulling away from the hardware store. Two women with strollers pausing to talk on the corner. The everyday world unreasonably intact. She said one other thing the last time I saw her. Claudette said quietly. 3 weeks before she passed. She said, "Claudette, I've done everything I can from my end. The rest is up to Russell. I just hope he's still the man I married." My eyes burned so fiercely that I had to look up at the ceiling and blink hard 3 times. "Tell her I am," I said. Then it hit me and my chest split right down the middle. Old habit, Claudette's eyes filled. She pressed her lips together hard and nodded. I got to my feet, tucked the folder under my arm, and pulled out my phone. I called Gerald on the way to the door. "I've got Tibbs's report." I said it's a map, not evidence, but it documents a woman named Renee with 2 previous husbands, both of them stripped clean after the wedding. "And Gerald, there's a name in here I need you to track down. A marina broker who worked with her up in Seattle, a man named Chet Pelham." Gerald went very quiet. Then he said, "Russell Harriet Branna from Harbor Savings Bank called me this morning. She says she has something you need to see." Harbor Savings Bank sat on the corner of Highway 101 and Harborview Drive, a 3-story brick building that had operated as the same bank under 3 different names since 1977. Dorothea and I had kept our accounts there for 30 years. The tellers knew us by name. The branch manager had sent flowers to the funeral. That branch manager was Harriet Branna. She was waiting for me in the small conference room off the main floor, a woman of 60 with reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and the careful, contained manner of someone who had been losing sleep over a decision for weeks. She stood when I came in, took my hand in both of hers, and held it a half-second longer than a professional greeting called for. "Mr. Callahan," she said, "thank you for coming. Please sit down. What I'm about to discover in the next few minutes will lay bare just how deep the planning against me truly ran, and how much had already been decided before I ever knew to be afraid. Before we get there, tell me this: if someone you trusted had been quietly working against you, would you confront them the moment you suspected, or would you wait and build your case in silence? I sat. She settled across from me and laid a thin folder on the table, keeping one hand pressed flat on top of it. "I want to say first," she began, her voice tight with something that sounded a great deal like guilt, "that I should have reached out to you sooner. I've been going back and forth on that." She pressed her lips together hard. "I was worried about the bank's exposure. If I flagged something that turned out to be a misunderstanding, the liability implications I talked myself into, waiting to see how things developed." I'm not proud of it. What did you see, Harriet? I asked. She opened the folder and turned it to face me. On June 2nd, someone attempted to access Dorothea's personal savings account using a durable power of attorney document that Colin had on file with us. The document itself was legitimate. Dorothea had granted Colin limited POA during her illness to help manage certain transactions. Harriet tapped the paper, but a durable power of attorney in Oregon terminates automatically upon the death of the person who granted it. Dorothea passed on May 23rd. That POA became legally void the moment she died. I felt the muscles in my neck go rigid. He tried to use it 10 days after she was gone. He attempted to move $42,000 from her personal savings into a joint account he had set up the previous year. Harriet's jaw was tight. Our system caught it automatically. The POA termination date was matched against the death certificate we had on file. The transfer was blocked, but the attempt was logged. She slid the transaction record across to me. I have that log, and I'm prepared to hand it over to your attorney. I looked at the figure on the page. $42,000. The money Dorothea had set aside over 22 years of teaching, saved in small amounts, the kind of accumulation that comes from a lifetime of being careful with what you have. My throat went tight and hot. I pushed the anger back down because anger right now would not help me read what was in front of me. There's something else, Harriet said. She reached back into the folder and drew out a second document. A loan agreement, 4 pages held together with a paperclip. This came to our attention during a routine compliance review last month. It's a private lending agreement from March of 2022, a loan of $340,000 from a private lender to Colin Callahan's charter business. The agreement lists you as a co-signer. She turned the last page toward me and pointed to the signature line. I looked at the signature. The handwriting was mine. The particular way I crossed the T and rustle the slight backward lean of the R. The way the letters run together, it was my handwriting or something, engineered to look exactly like it. Mr. Callahan, Harriet said carefully. Did you sign this document? I studied that signature for a long time. My pulse was beating hard in my ears. I have never signed anything for Colin's business, I said. Not once. Not a check, not a guarantee, not a loan application, never. Harriet exhaled slowly, like she had been holding that breath for weeks. That's what I suspected. Our fraud analyst flagged it when it came up in a related account review. The signature shows signs of digital reproduction. Specifically, the ink pressure is completely uniform across every letter, which doesn't happen in a real signature, where the hand varies pressure naturally. This was printed from a digital file. The conference room felt like it was closing in. I leaned back in my chair and looked up at the ceiling for a moment, because I needed a few seconds to hold myself in one piece before I said something I couldn't walk back. Do you know which document the signature was lifted from? My voice came out very level. I was almost surprised by that. We don't, Harriet said. But given the quality of the reproduction, our analyst believes it was scanned from an original with a high-resolution scanner, then extracted and placed digitally onto the loan document. I knew the instant she said it. The birthday card. 2 years ago, Colin's 41st birthday. I had written him a card, a thick ivory one with a lighthouse on the front, that Dorothea picked out. I had signed the inside, "Happy birthday, Colin, love Dad." My full signature clean and centered on the card, the way I always sign things that matter. Colin had stood in the kitchen and thanked me for it. He had set it on the mantel of his house in Portland, and it had stayed there for months. I had seen it myself on my last visit, still sitting there next to a lamp. I pressed both palms flat against my thighs under the table and pushed down until my knuckles ached. He used a birthday card, I said. and the words came out barely above a whisper because anything louder, and I wasn't sure what would come after them. I signed it with love, and he turned it into a forged loan document. Harriet looked at me with an expression I can only describe as grief on someone else's behalf. Her eyes had gone glassy. "Mr. Callahan, I'm so sorry." I stood up. I picked up the folder. "I need to take these to my attorney." "Those are your copies," she said quickly, rising as well. "I have the originals secured. Mr. Ashford can call me directly. I'll cooperate fully." She paused. "For what it's worth, I should have called you the week it happened. I'm genuinely sorry I didn't." I looked at her. The guilt on her face was real. "You called now," I said. "That matters." Out in the parking lot, I sat in my truck for 4 minutes without starting the engine. I held the folder on the steering wheel and stared through the windshield at the ordinary Tuesday afternoon of Astoria, Oregon. People moving in and out of the pharmacy across the street, a dog pulling its owner toward a fire hydrant, a kid on a skateboard cutting through the lot. Then I called Gerald. "He used a birthday card," I said when Gerald picked up. "He scanned my signature off a birthday card I gave him and forged it onto a 340 tacos loan document." Gerald said nothing for a moment, then spoke in a voice stripped of all its professional armor. "Russell, I'm sorry." 2 words from a man who had practiced law for 40 years and had heard everything there was to hear. Those 2 words landed harder than anything else had. "How much debt is he actually carrying?" I asked. "Between the charter business losses, this loan deferred taxes, and 2 other private notes Pete's contact had identified through the harbor filing records. Gerald said the number is close to 1.8 million. A pause. "Russell, I've also been going through the public records Tibbs pointed us toward. Renee didn't just have bad luck in her previous marriages. I'm finding evidence that she was the one who structured both asset transfers. I'll have the details for you by tomorrow, but there's something else that needs your attention first." "Luca," I said suddenly, because the thought of my grandson had been sitting at the back of my mind since I walked out of that bank, and it wouldn't leave me alone. "Actually, Gerald said Luca called my office an hour ago." Luca had not called Gerald to report his parents. He had called to ask whether his grandfather was all right. Gerald told me that with the particular gentleness of a man delivering news, he knew would land in 2 directions, at once relief and grief taking up the same space in my chest at the same moment. My grandson, 19 years old, studying marine engineering at Oregon State, had looked up my attorney's number and called to check on me. Not on his father. On me. I drove home from the bank, with that sitting in my chest, like a warm light burning in a cold room. That evening, Gerald sent me the file on Renee's previous marriages, compiled from public divorce records, in 2 states, cross-referenced with property transfer documents and court filings. I sat at my kitchen table with my reading glasses on and worked through every page. The facts were as Tibbs had outlined, but Gerald had found the specifics that turned a pattern into a profile. The first husband, Gage Tilford, an architect in San Diego. Renee had met him at a waterfront development showcase in 2009, an event tied directly to his professional work. Within a year, they were married. Within 18 months, she had been added to the deed on his condominium and named as joint account holder on his investment portfolio. The divorce was filed in 2012. Tilford lost the condo and 60% of his liquid assets in the settlement. His attorney had filed a motion alleging financial manipulation, but it was dismissed for insufficient evidence. The second husband, a commercial real estate broker in Seattle named Brent Holloway. Same pattern met at an industry event, rapid progression joint assets divorce within 3 years. Holloway lost his business investment account, and his partnership stake in a commercial property. His sister had given a statement during the proceedings, saying Renee had systematically discouraged Holloway from seeing his family in the 18 months leading up to the divorce. At the bottom of the file, Gerald had added a handwritten note. She does not stumble into money. She researches it, moves into its orbit deliberately, and extracts it. Public records confirm what Tibbs observed. We now have 2 documented instances. With Colin, it would be 3. I took my reading glasses off and pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes until white spots bloomed in the dark. What did I let into my family? I said to the empty kitchen. My voice cracked on the last word, and I didn't try to stop it. The following morning, a knock came at my back door at 8:15. Luca stood on the porch with his hands pushed into his jacket pockets, his dark hair damp from the morning fog. He had Dorothea's eyes, that particular shade of brown that went almost gold in certain light. And right now those eyes were carrying something heavy. "Grandpa," he said, "can I come in?" I opened the door wider, and he stepped inside and stood in my kitchen, the way he had stood in this kitchen since he was old enough to walk, slightly too tall for the space, slightly uncertain what to do with his hands, but completely at home here. "Sit down," I said. "You want coffee, please?" He pulled out the chair at the end of the table, always the same chair, the one nearest the window. He wrapped both hands around the mug I set in front of him and looked down into it. "Is everything okay, Grandpa? Like really okay?" "Why do you ask?" I kept my voice easy, the way you keep your hands steady when you're working near something breakable. Luca looked up at me, and the conflict on his face was so visible and so painful that my chest ached just looking at it. "I heard them talking last week. Mom and Dad." He swallowed hard. "About legal stuff. About you. It didn't sound like they were worried about you." His jaw went tight. It sounded like they were making plans. I sat down across from him and looked at my grandson. This boy I had watched learn to walk on this kitchen floor, who had his mother's eyes and his grandmother's stubborn honesty and his own particular kind of courage that I was watching him use right now at real cost to himself. "What kind of plans?" I asked. "I don't know exactly." Luca's hands tightened around the mug until his knuckles went pale. "But Dad mentioned a date, September something, and a lawyer's name. And he said," he stopped, pressed his lips together until they went white, then made himself continue. "He said once the boat situation was resolved, everything else would follow." The boat situation. I put my hand over Luca's on the table. "Thank you for telling me," I said. His shoulders dropped with the sudden release of someone who had been holding something far too heavy for far too long. His eyes went red at the corners. "I don't know what to do, Grandpa. He's my dad. But what I'm hearing, it doesn't sound like him. It sounds like someone else wearing his face." "I know," I said. "And whatever happens, none of what's going on is anything you caused." "I'm not going to do anything to hurt you," Luca said, and his voice broke slightly on the last 2 words. "I need you to know that." "I do know that," I said. He nodded, finished his coffee, and left 20 minutes later. I stood at the back door and watched his car back down the drive and turn toward Highway 101. That evening, my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost sent it to voicemail. Something made me pick up. "Mr. Callahan," a man's voice, controlled, careful, carrying the particular tone of someone who had spent time deciding whether to make this call at all. "My name is Chet Pelham. I understand you've been asking questions about Renee. I think we have something to talk about." My grip tightened on the phone until I could feel my own pulse against my palm. "How did you get this number?" I asked. "The marina community is smaller than most people realize." He said, "Mr. Callahan, I'm not calling to make trouble. I'm calling because I have something you need, and because I have my own reasons for wanting this particular situation to reach a resolution." A pause. "Can we meet?" Cannon Beach sat 40 minutes north of Astoria on Highway 101, the kind of coastal town that occupies the space between tourist destination and working community. Chet Pelham had chosen a coffee shop on the main strip, not a chain, not somewhere either of us would be known, exactly the kind of place a man picks when he wants to talk, without being seen doing it. He was already there when I arrived. Corner table back to the wall facing the entrance. He was 45, broad-shouldered, with the weathered look of someone who had spent real time around water rather than simply selling property adjacent to it. He watched me cross the room with the careful eyes of a man taking a measurement. I sat down across from him and didn't offer my hand first. "Mr. Callahan," he said. "Thank you for coming. You said you had something I needed." I said. "I'm here. Talk." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and leaned forward slightly. "I'm going to be straight with you about who I am and why I'm doing this, because I think you're the kind of man who'd rather have the honest version than a polished one." He held my gaze steadily. "I'm not doing this out of guilt. I'm doing this because Renee Osgood, that's her name before she became Renee Callahan, burned me 4 years ago in Seattle, and I have been waiting for the moment to make sure it doesn't happen again without consequence." "Tell me about Seattle," I said. Chet exhaled. "We worked at the same marina brokerage for 2 years. We had a personal relationship for about 6 months of that. I'm not proud of the overlap, but I'm not going to pretend it didn't exist." His jaw tightened. When she left the company, a transaction I had handled was suddenly under compliance review. A client had filed a complaint about misrepresented vessel valuations. The paperwork on that deal had my name on it. The decisions on that deal had been made by Renee. His voice dropped half a register, hard and controlled. "She walked away clean. I spent 8 months in regulatory review, lost 2 major clients, and rebuilt my reputation from the ground up in a different market. And you knew she was involved with my son," I said. When I heard the Callahan name connected to a waterfront property listing in Astoria, I started paying attention. He picked up his phone, turned it face up on the table. "3 months ago, Renee contacted me to handle the brokerage side of a boat transaction. Didn't tell me whose boat, just said it was a vintage Matthews coming out of an Astoria estate, clean title, motivated seller." He looked at me directly. I agreed, and I started recording every conversation we had from that point on. "Oregon is a one-party consent state," I said. "I know exactly what I did, and I know it was legal," Chet said. "I've dealt with this woman before. I wasn't going in without protection." He unlocked his phone, opened an audio file, and set it on the table between us. Renee's voice came through the small speaker clearly enough that the hair on the back of my neck stood up. She was speaking with the crisp, unhurried confidence of someone who had no reason to believe she was being recorded. "Colin is the door, not the destination. The boat and the property are the assets. Once those are liquidated and the estate is settled, everything else resolves itself." Another voice, Chet asked, "What about Colin after the transaction closes?" Renee's answer came without a single beat of hesitation. "After doesn't concern me." The coffee shop noise moved around us, someone ordering at the counter, a kid laughing near the window, the ordinary sounds of a Tuesday afternoon. I sat very still and felt something cold pass through my chest. That was not grief and was not anger, but was something older and heavier than either, the recognition of just how completely and deliberately my son had been used as a means to an end. "After doesn't concern her," I said, and my voice came out quieter than I intended. "There's more." Chet scrolled to another file. "This one is from a call between Renee and the appraiser she hired to value the Marigold. She directed him specifically to document restoration quality and market comparables in a format designed to support a probate sale rather than a private transaction. She knew exactly what legal process she was building toward. He pushed a USB drive across the table. Everything is on there. Audio files, email records between me and Renee about the transaction, and the appraiser's contact information. Take it to whoever needs to see it. I picked up the drive and held it in my palm. Such a small thing. The weight of it was almost nothing. Mr. Pelham, I said, did Colin know about Renee's history before he married her? The previous marriages, the pattern? Chet looked at me, and for the first time his expression shifted into something close to reluctant. He didn't want to answer this, but he did. I sent him a message 14 months ago, anonymous account, but specific enough that he would have known it came from someone with real knowledge. I told him to look up Gage Tilford in San Diego and Brent Holloway in Seattle and ask them directly what happened to their assets after their marriages ended. My stomach turned. He blocked the account within 24 hours. Chet held my gaze without flinching. He didn't investigate. He didn't ask questions. He made a choice. Mr. Callahan, I want you to understand that because I think you're the kind of man who might be inclined to give his son the benefit of the doubt. And in this case, there is no doubt left to give. That truth landed in my chest, like something dropped from a great height. I thought of Colin at 43, his business drowning under $1.8 million of debt, sitting with an anonymous message telling him the woman he had married was dangerous and deleting it. Not because he didn't believe it, but because he needed her too much to act on it. My eyes burned. I blinked it back hard. I tucked the USB drive into my jacket pocket, got to my feet, and extended my hand. Chet shook it. You're not doing this for me, I said. Not an accusation, just a statement of fact. No, he said without apology. But it'll help you anyway. On the drive back to Astoria, Gerald's message came through on my phone. I pulled over to read it. Dorian Fitch has filed for emergency conservatorship hearing. Date set for September 15th. Russell, we have 6 weeks. I stared at that message for a long moment. Then I pulled back onto the highway, pressed the accelerator down, and drove. 6 weeks felt like both too much and not nearly enough. I pinned a calendar page to the wall above my desk. September 15th circled in red marker the way I used to mark storm windows and engine overhaul deadlines back when the yard was at its busiest. Except those deadlines had consequences measured in money and inconvenience. This one was measured in something I didn't have a word for yet. Gerald and I worked the phones daily. He was building the counter-petition, a formal legal response to Fitch's conservatorship filing that would present the camera footage, Harriet's bank records, Chet's audio files, and Dorothea's trust as a unified argument that Russell Callahan was not a man in decline, but a man being deliberately targeted. Gerald laid it out plainly one morning over coffee in his office. We are not just defending you, he spreading the documents across the desk with the focused energy of a man who had found his purpose. We are proving to the court that this entire proceeding was manufactured. The medical evaluation was coached. The financial documents were forged. The petition was filed before Dorothea was even gone. He tapped each file as he named it. Every piece connects. Fitch built a paper cage around you. We are going to dismantle it piece by piece in front of a judge. What do you need from me between now and September 15th, I asked. Keep the camera running. Keep documenting and stay visible in your community, at the yard, at the dock, in town. The strongest counter to an incompetency claim is a man living a fully functional life in plain sight. I did all of those things. The days were manageable. The nights were different. It was a Thursday evening in late August when it happened. I had been on the boat, not going anywhere, just sitting in the cockpit with a glass of whiskey and the GPS app open on my phone, watching the dot that was the Marigold sitting stationary at Anchor Bay Marina in Gig Harbor, Washington. She had been there 7 weeks. I had been watching that dot every day the way you watch a wound that isn't healing. I opened my contacts and found Colin's name. My thumb hovered over the call button for a very long time. I thought about calling him and saying, "Come home. Come back to Astoria. Tell me it isn't as bad as it looks. Tell me there's some explanation I haven't considered yet. Tell me you're still the boy who fell asleep in the cabin of that boat at 8 years old, with a fishing line still in your hand." My chest ached with how much I wanted that conversation to be possible. I was genuinely going to call. My thumb was on the button. Then Pete's footsteps came down the dock. That particular heavy, unhurried tread I had known for 35 years. He stepped aboard, without asking the way he had always done, and he took one look at me, and the phone in my hand sat down across from me and said, "Don't." His voice wasn't harsh, not scolding. It was the voice of a man who knew me well enough to say one word and mean everything that needed saying. "He's still my son, Pete," I said, and my throat tightened around the words until they came out broken and raw. "He is still my son." "I know he is." Pete leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his big hands clasped together. "And I know what it cost you to do this, Russ. I know what it cost you every single morning to get up and keep building this case instead of picking up that phone and trying to fix it the old way." His eyes were red at the rims. Pete, who I had never seen come close to tears in 35 years of friendship. But Dorothea spent the last months of her life building something to keep you safe. She sat across from Gerald, and she sat across from Arlo Tibbs, and she put everything she had into protecting you. His voice cracked slightly on her name. "Don't waste that because you still love him." I set the phone face down on the seat beside me. "I will always love him," I said. "I know," Pete said, "but loving him doesn't mean letting him win." I poured what was left of the whiskey over the side of the boat and watched it dissolve into the black water of Astoria Bay. 2 days later, Gerald called with news that reshaped the weeks that remained. "Dr. Keene contacted me," he said. "She wants to meet. She says she has recordings." I gripped the phone hard. "She's flipping. She called it correcting a mistake." Gerald said, "I'll take it either way." A pause. She looked up Dorothea's obituary, Russell. She said 3 of her cousins had Dorothea as a teacher at Astoria High. She said, and I'm reading this directly from my notes, "Mrs. Callahan would have been deeply disappointed in what I did." I sat down heavily in the kitchen chair. The back of my eyes burned. "Set the meeting," I said. At the meeting, a neutral coffee shop in Cannon Beach, because apparently that town was becoming the location for every significant conversation in my life. Dr. Keene looked like a woman who hadn't slept properly in weeks. She set a digital recorder on the table and pushed it toward Gerald with both hands. "The way you put down something you have been carrying too long. 2 recordings," she said. "One is Renee coaching me before I examined Russell. The other is a call with Dorian Fitch's assistant, telling me specifically what diagnostic language to use in my report." Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. "I know what this means for my career. I've spoken to my own attorney. I'm prepared for the consequences." Gerald picked up the recorder. "Dr. Keene, this is significant. I want to be clear. By providing this, you may be subject to licensing review and civil liability from multiple parties." "I know," she said. I signed my name to a document designed to strip a healthy man of his legal rights. She looked at me directly for the first time since we'd sat down, and her eyes carried something genuine. "I'm sorry, Mr. Callahan. That's not sufficient, but I don't have anything better to offer." I looked at this woman who had walked into my house and tried to help cage me, who was now sitting across from me with her career balanced on the edge of what she was about to do. "You're doing the right thing now," I said. "That counts." Walking out to the parking lot afterward, Gerald fell into step beside me. "Floyd Mabry confirmed this morning," he said quietly. "He'll be at Anchor Bay Marina whenever we need him." The pieces were in place, all except one. "Luca," I said. Gerald nodded. "That one's yours to decide, Russell. 5 days before the hearing, I finally used the key. The cabinet sat at the far end of the dock, exactly where it had stood for 38 years. Sea green paint bleached by salt and sun. The brass hasp gone dull. The whole thing looking like something the tide might have left behind. Dorothea and I had picked it up at an estate auction in Cannon Beach. The autumn we relocated to Astoria, paid $12 for it, argued cheerfully about whether it was charming or just old. We never did settle that debate. Now I stood before it in the pale September afternoon light, a brass key in my hand, my heart hammering against my ribs like I was unlocking something I'd never be able to lock again. The key turned without resistance. The lock had been oiled recently. Dorothea had seen to that too. Inside the cabinet, wrapped in a waterproof canvas sleeve, was a tin box. I carried it to the bench at the dock's edge, sat down and opened it with hands that weren't quite steady. Everything inside had been arranged with the careful precision of a schoolteacher who'd spent decades putting things in order so others could find them. On top sat the trust document, the original signed and notarized, Gerald's firm stamp on the cover page. Beneath it, Arlo Tibbs's original investigation report, the same one Claudette had handed me a copy of in her bookstore. Then a manila envelope labeled in Dorothea's handwriting, "For Gerald. Open only if Colin moves against Russell." I set that one aside for Gerald. Then a USB drive labeled in the same measured hand, "D last video." And at the very bottom, a slim journal with a dark blue cover. There was one more thing nestled beneath the journal, a photograph. Colin, at 8 years old, standing on this dock, with a fishing rod, grinning the way children grin when the world hasn't yet shown them what it intends to ask of them. I held it a long moment. Then I carried it down to the Marigold and slid it behind the engine compartment's rear access panel between the frame and the GPS unit Pete had bolted there weeks ago. I wanted Colin to find it. I wanted him to have to look at that boy before he could look at me. I opened the journal first. Dorothea's handwriting filled the pages in her even, deliberate script, the same hand that had graded thousands of student essays, written hundreds of letters to parents, signed my birthday cards for 42 years. I turned to a page near the middle and read, "February 3rd, Colin called today." He asked again casually, the way he asks things he's been turning over in his mind for a long time, whether we'd considered adding his name to the deed on the house for estate planning purposes, he said. I told him the estate planning was handled. He said he was just thinking ahead. I said, "We all are." I turned more pages. March 12th. I tried something today that I'm not proud of, but I needed to know. I told Colin, as if in pain, that Russell had been talking about signing the Marigold over to him directly to sidestep the complications of probate. I said Russell had mentioned it just last week. I watched Colin's face when I said it. Dorothea had underlined the next sentence twice. He drove down from Portland that same afternoon. Didn't call first. Didn't ask how I was feeling or whether I needed anything. He showed up with a folder of paperwork. I had to stop reading. My throat closed so completely that I pressed the back of my wrist hard against my mouth and breathed through my nose until the pressure behind my eyes eased. My whole body felt like something inside had given way. Not broken, shifted the way a structure settles when a load it has long been bearing is suddenly lifted. She had known. She had tested him, and he had failed within hours. And she had lived with that knowledge alone for months while she was dying. "Oh, Dorothea," I said to the water and the September sky and the 38 years of mornings we had shared on this dock. You carried all of this by yourself. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand and picked up the USB drive. I carried the tin box back to the house and sat at my desk and plugged the drive into my laptop. One video file, 11 minutes and 47 seconds. I pressed play. Dorothea sat at our kitchen table, the same table where I drank my coffee every morning, where Luca had sat 2 weeks ago, with his hands wrapped around a mug. She was wearing the green cardigan I had given her 2 Christmases ago. Her hair was shorter than I remembered from the healthy years, but her eyes were clear and direct, and completely unmistakably herself. "Russell," she said, looking straight into the camera with the composure of a woman who had made her peace before pressing record. "If you're watching this, then things went the way I was afraid they might. I want to explain some things to you, and I want to start by saying, I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner." She explained the trust. She explained why she had worked with Gerald in secret. Her voice was steady and measured the teacher's voice, the one she used when she needed someone to understand something important, and had learned that calm worked better than emotion. Then she said, "There's a section of this recording for Colin. I'd like you to hear it too." She looked directly at the camera, and something in her expression shifted. Not cold, but completely resolved. "Colin, if you are watching this after attempting to take your father's boat, then you became the person I spent the last year of my life hoping you wouldn't become. I want you to know that I see you not the man you are right now, but the boy you were. The boy your father taught to tie a bowline on that dock. That boy was good. What happened to him is something I grieve." She paused and her jaw tightened slightly. "But I also want you to know something else. I gave you every chance to stop. Every single chance. What comes next is the result of choices you made, not things that were done to you." Then she looked back at the camera with an expression that went directly through my chest, like a key into a lock. "Russell, I didn't protect the boat. I protected the man who built his life around it. Please live that life for both of us." The video ended. I sat at my desk in the stillness of the house for a long time. The September light moved across the floor. Somewhere outside, a gull called twice and fell silent. Then I picked up my phone and called Gerald. "I found everything," I said, my voice rough but steady. "The original trust, Tibbs's report, the journal, the video. She built the whole system, Gerald. Every piece of it." Gerald was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, the professional edge had left his voice entirely. "She was remarkable, Russell." Yes, I said. "She was." I cleared my throat. "The hearing is in 5 days. Tell me our move." "We let them walk into what she built." Gerald said, "I've spoken to Petra Solis at Harbor Patrol. Harriet is ready. Floyd Mabry confirmed Friday at Anchor Bay Marina." A pause. "There's one piece left. Luca." I looked out the window toward the dock where the cabinet sat at the far end, sea green and salt-bleached and full of everything Dorothea had left me. "He's Dorothea's grandson," I said. "I'll talk to him tonight." Luca knocked at 8:43 that evening. I know the exact time because I had been watching the clock, had been watching it since I called him 2 hours earlier and asked him to come by when he could. He stood on the back porch with his jacket zipped to the collar against the September chill, a laptop bag over one shoulder, wearing the expression of someone who had crossed a line in their own mind and was still deciding whether they regretted it. "Come in," I said. "Sit down." He came through the door, set the bag carefully on the kitchen table, and remained standing. His jaw was tight. His eyes moved to the bag and back to me with the restless energy of someone who had rehearsed what to say and found that none of it fit now that the moment had actually arrived. "Grandpa," he said, "before you say anything, I need you to know I did this because I chose to. Nobody talked me into it. Nobody pressured me. His voice was steady, but the muscle along his jaw was working hard. I made a decision, and I'm prepared to live with whatever it costs. The weight of those words from a 19-year-old boy hit me somewhere behind the sternum. I pulled out the chair across from him. "Sit down, Luca," I said gently, "and tell me what you did." He sat. He unzipped the bag and set a USB drive on the table between us, then laid both hands flat on either sides of it like he was anchoring it in place. 3 weeks ago, he said, Dad was getting ready to drive up to Gig Harbor. He was in a hurry. He had a call running long on his phone, and he came into the kitchen and asked me to keep an eye on his laptop while he packed. Luca looked at me directly. He trusts me because he forgets I'm studying computer systems engineering. He left the laptop open and unlocked on the kitchen table and walked out of the room. I kept my face neutral. "Go on." I had a flash drive in my bag from a class assignment, 128 GB. Luca's hands pressed harder against the table. I had 4 minutes before he came back. I copied his entire business folder and his legal folder onto the drive. He swallowed. Then I slipped the drive into my jacket pocket, and when he came back, I told him his call had gone to voicemail and asked if he needed anything before he left. His voice dropped. He said no. He ruffled my hair the way he used to when I was 12. And he left. The image of that Colin ruffling his son's hair with no idea what Luca had just done landed in my chest with an ache I couldn't fully name. "What did you find when you went through it?" I asked. Luca reached into the laptop bag again and pulled out a printed stack of pages. His hands were trembling slightly now, the adrenaline of the decision draining away and the full reality of what he was doing settling over him. Email threads with someone named Chet Pelham about a boat transaction at Anchor Bay Marina, he said, placing the first page down a document called Final Sale Draft. The Marigold 285,000 with a closing date of September 12th. He laid down the second page, a spreadsheet titled Russell Transition Plan, with dates, facility names, and a column for estimated property listing timeline. He set down the third page, and his voice went tight. And a file called Astoria House Listing Prep, created in Renee's name with comparable sales and a suggested listing price for your house. My house. The house where Dorothea had planted purple irises, the house where Luca had learned to walk across the kitchen floor. I picked up the pages one at a time. My hands were entirely steady, which surprised me. The anger was there, deep and cold and very quiet, but more controlled than I'd expected. Luca. I set the pages down and looked across the table at my grandson. His eyes were red at the corners, his jaw still tight, his shoulders carrying the weight of a choice that had cost him something real. "Do you understand what this means for your relationship with your father?" His breath hitched once, sharp, involuntary. Then he pulled himself back together with an effort that made my chest hurt to watch. "He stopped being my dad a long time ago," Luca said, and the words split right down the middle on the last one. "The man who taught me to read nautical charts and took me fishing every summer and told me a man's word was worth more than his money. That man has been gone for years." His voice broke fully on the next sentence, and he let it, didn't try to stop it. "I've been grieving him for a long time, Grandpa. I just didn't have a name for it until now." I stood and put my hand on the back of his neck, the way I used to when he was small and frightened, and I felt him let out a long, shuddering breath that carried something enormous with it. "Your grandmother would be so proud of you," I said. Luca pressed the back of his hand hard against his eyes. His shoulders shook once, twice, then steadied. "What happens now?" he asked. "Friday morning," I said. Anchor Bay Marina Gig Harbor. I need you to bring everything on that drive and be there by 8:00. I held his gaze. Are you ready for that? Luca sat up straighter in the chair. The red hadn't left his eyes, but something else had come into them, the particular resolve of someone who has already paid the hardest price and is no longer afraid of what follows. I'll be there, he said. After he left, I called Gerald. Luca's in, I said. He has email records, the sale draft, the assisted living timeline, and Renee's listing prep for the house. It's all on a drive. Gerald exhaled slowly. Then we have everything, Russell. A pause, and his voice took on the quiet certainty of a man who had spent weeks building something and could finally see it standing. Friday morning, let's end this. I left Astoria at 3:10 in the morning. The highway north was empty at that hour, just headlights cutting through the dark and the sound of the truck engine, which I had rebuilt twice and knew as well as my own heartbeat. I drove with both hands on the wheel and Dorothea's letter folded in my shirt pocket and 4 months of preparation sitting in my chest like a held breath. Anchor Bay Marina in Gig Harbor, Washington, was 212 miles from Astoria. I had looked it up so many times over the past 7 weeks that I could have drawn the layout from memory, the main dock, the fuel station, the covered berths along the north side where the Marigold had been sitting since Colin brought her up in June. I arrived at 5:40 and parked on the street above the marina facing the water. The September morning was cold and gray, the kind of Pacific Northwest dawn that comes reluctantly, the light building in slow increments behind a wall of clouds. I poured coffee from my thermos and waited. Gerald arrived at 6:15 in a rented sedan parked 2 spaces down, walked over and climbed into my passenger seat without a word. He looked like a man who had also not slept, but whose mind was running clean and sharp regardless. Everyone's in position, he said, wrapping both hands around the coffee cup I handed him. Harriet drove up last night. Pete rode with her. Petra Solis has coordinated with the Gig Harbor Harbor Patrol. She has jurisdiction here through a reciprocal coastal enforcement agreement, so her presence is completely legitimate. Floyd, Gerald said, was already inside the marina office. He'd made contact with the dock manager the day before presenting himself as a prospective buyer with interest in a 1963 Matthews motor yacht. Gerald's mouth curved slightly. The dock manager was very helpful. We watched the marina come to life slowly. Gulls working the water. A commercial fisherman heading out early, engine grumbling the ordinary machinery of a working waterfront indifferent to what was about to unfold on its docks. Colin's truck arrived at 7:58. Renee was with him. She stepped out of the passenger side in a jacket and dark slacks. Her hair neat, her whole bearing carrying the composed energy of someone arriving to close a business deal. She stood at the dock approach and checked her phone while Colin went to speak with the dock manager. Floyd Mabry came out of the marina office 2 minutes later, extending his hand to Colin with the easy warmth of a man who collects beautiful boats and has the money to prove it. Floyd was 63 broad, with a kind of unhurried confidence that comes from decades at sea and a retirement comfortable enough that he had nothing to prove to anyone. Mr. Callahan, Floyd said, shaking Colin's hand. She's even more beautiful in person than the photos. I appreciate you making the trip. Of course, Colin said, and the relief in his voice was audible from where I sat in the truck. She's a remarkable vessel. I think you're going to love her. I climbed out of the truck. Gerald walked beside me as we moved toward the dock. Pete fell into step from his position near the fuel station, his face set and steady. Harriet Branna came from the parking area carrying a leather portfolio. Officer Petra Solis, a woman of 35 in Harbor Patrol uniform, with the alert, measured manner of someone trained to de-escalate and document simultaneously, positioned herself at the dock entrance. I watched Colin lead Floyd down the gangway toward the Marigold, pointing out features, talking through the restoration history, with the fluency of someone who had done his research. My research. The decades of work I had poured into that boat now being used as a sales pitch. My jaw ached. My hands were steady. Colin unlocked the cabin and they went below. A minute passed. Then Floyd's voice carried up from the cockpit. "I'd like to check the engine compartment. I always inspect the mechanical spaces personally before I commit." "Absolutely," Colin said. "Let me show you." I heard the engine hatch open, then silence from below for a long moment. Then Colin's voice came up, stripped of its salesman's warmth, scraped down to something raw and barely recognizable. "What is this?" Floyd came back up the companionway steps with the unhurried pace of a man whose part was finished. He stepped onto the dock and looked at me with an expression that said everything without a word. I walked down the gangway and stepped aboard the Marigold for the first time in 3 months. The teak deck was exactly as I remembered it. The brass fittings, the particular sound the hull made against the dock lines, everything exactly as I had left it, except now it was 3 states from home, and my son was standing in the engine compartment, holding something in both hands. I ducked into the cabin and looked down through the hatch. Colin was holding the photograph, 8 years old fishing rod, the grin that belonged to a boy who hadn't yet learned to be afraid of anything. He was staring at it with an expression I had never seen on my son's face before. Not guilt, not anger, something more fundamental than either. The look of a man confronting a version of himself he could no longer claim. "Step off the boat, Colin," I said. His head came up. His eyes met mine, and for one moment, one single unguarded moment, he looked like that boy in the photograph. Then the adult closed back over it, and he climbed the steps and stood on the deck. He looked past me at the dock, at Gerald with his folder, at Harriet, with her portfolio, at Pete standing with his arms crossed, and his jaw set, at Petra Solis in her uniform, at the dock entrance, at Luca, who had just arrived slightly breathless from running from the parking area, standing at the top of the gangway with a USB drive in his hand, and his grandmother's eyes holding something that was equal parts grief and resolve. Colin looked at his son for a long moment. The photograph was still in his hand. Then he looked at Renee on the dock above, and something passed between them. Not a plan, not a signal, just the sudden shared recognition that the ground had shifted completely beneath them both. "Dad," Colin said, and his voice came out cracked and small. "I can explain." "I know you can," I said. "But first, Gerald has something to read." Gerald opened his folder on the dock in the gray September morning, and the world went very quiet. Not the marina. The marina continued its indifferent business lines, creaking against cleats, water slapping the hull, a radio playing somewhere in the distance. But the space the 6 of us occupied on that gangway felt sealed off from all of it. Pressurized like the moment before a weather system breaks. Dorothea Eleanor Callahan executed a separate revocable trust. On January 14th of this year, Gerald began his voice carrying the precise, unhurried authority of a man who had been building toward this moment for months. She amended that trust on May 14th, 9 days before her death. "I am the named trustee. Under the terms of that trust, the Marigold cannot be sold during Russell Callahan's lifetime without his written consent witnessed by 2 independent parties." He looked up from the page directly at Colin. "Any attempt to sell, transfer, or otherwise dispose of this vessel without that consent constitutes a direct violation of the Trust's Conduct Clause. Upon documented evidence of such a violation, the offending party forfeits all rights under the Trust automatically and permanently." Colin's face had gone the color of old ash. "I haven't sold anything," he said, his voice carrying the brittle quality of an argument that already knows it has lost. "We were just..." The closing documents were drafted for today, Gerald said, and he laid the first page from Luca's USB printout on the dock rail between them. September 12th, $285,000. Buyer Floyd Mabry. He nodded toward Floyd, who had moved to stand quietly at the edge of the group. Mr. Mabry is a friend of your father's. He has been for 30 years. Whatever color remained in Colin's face drained out completely. Renee stepped forward from the dock, above her voice sharp and controlled. Colin signed those documents as the authorized party. I was acting in a support capacity only. Whatever legal exposure exists here belongs to Mr. Callahan. Gerald turned to her with the calm precision of a man who had been waiting for exactly this move. I have a recording of you directing the appraiser you hired to document the Marigold's value in a format specifically designed to support a probate sale. I have a recording of you stating that Colin was, in your words, the door, not the destination. And I have documented evidence that you researched this family's assets before your marriage. He paused. The pattern is consistent with your 2 previous marriages. Public records in San Diego and Seattle confirm it. Renee's jaw tightened. For the first time in every interaction I had ever witnessed with this woman, she had nothing ready to say. Her eyes moved rapidly, calculating, measuring, searching for an exit that wasn't there. Harriet stepped forward and placed her portfolio on the dock rail beside Gerald's documents. Colin Callahan attempted to access Dorothea Callahan's personal savings account on June 2nd using a power of attorney that had terminated upon her death on May 23rd. She said with the careful precision of someone reading from a prepared statement, "I have the transaction log. I also have a loan agreement from March of 2022 bearing Russell Callahan's forged signature confirmed as digitally reproduced by our fraud analysis team." Colin made a sound that was not quite a word. His hand, the one still holding the photograph of himself at 8 years old, dropped to his side. Luca walked down the gangway and placed the USB drive in Gerald's hand without a word, but his eyes went to his father's face and stayed there, red-rimmed and aching with something that grief alone does not fully cover. Gerald plugged the drive into a small laptop he had carried in his bag, turned it toward Colin, and pressed play on the audio file. Renee's voice came through the speaker with crystalline clarity. Colin is the door, not the destination. Once the boat and the house are liquidated, everything else resolves itself. The marina sounds continued around us. A gull landed on a nearby piling and immediately departed. Somewhere a diesel engine turned over. Colin turned to look at Renee. Not with anger, but with something that looked like a man seeing a room clearly for the first time after a long stretch in the dark. "You said that," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "You actually said that." Renee looked back at him with eyes that were calculating to the last. "Colin, don't. You said after doesn't concern you." His voice cracked open on the word after. After. That's me. That's what I am to you. Renee pressed her lips together and said nothing further, which was itself the most complete answer she could have given. I stepped in front of my son. He looked at me, his eyes wet, his jaw working, his whole face carrying the particular devastation of a man who built something wrong and has just watched it collapse on him entirely. "Dad," he said, and his voice broke apart on that single word. "I'm sorry. I know it's not enough," I said. "Not yet." I kept my voice level because I needed him to hear what came next clearly. "But it's a start if you want it to be." I looked at him steadily. "Gerald has 2 options for you. You can review them now, or we can do this through the courts. Your choice, Colin." He closed his eyes for one moment. His shoulders shook once. Then he opened them and looked at Gerald. "Tell me the options," he said. Officer Petra Solis moved quietly up the dock toward Renee. "D's Osgood," she said, with the measured authority of her uniform. "I've been asked to inform you that the Gig Harbor Financial Crimes Unit has received a referral regarding fraudulent real estate activity and elder financial exploitation. I need to ask you to remain available for questioning." Renee's composure finally cracked, just for a second, just a fracture across the surface. Then she straightened her jacket and turned away from all of us, and I watched the woman who had walked into my family 3 years ago become in that moment simply a person with nowhere left to go. The conservatorship hearing on September 15th lasted 11 minutes. Dorian Fitch withdrew the petition before the judge had finished reading the case summary. He did it cleanly, professionally, with the practiced composure of a man who understood when a position was untenable and had the discipline not to make it worse. Gerald told me afterward that Fitch had seen the counterfiling that morning, the camera footage, the bank records, the audio files, the original trust, and had made the only calculation available to him. I was not in the courtroom. Gerald had told me I didn't need to be there, and he was right. I spent that Monday morning at my workbench in the yard, replacing the sacrificial zinc anodes on a client's outboard, doing the work my hands knew how to do. When Gerald called at 10:47 to tell me it was over, I set down my wrench, sat on the dock bench for a moment, and said, "Thank you, Gerald." "Thank Dorothea," he said. "She built the case. We just delivered it." The weeks that followed moved with the particular quality of time after a storm, things settling, debris, clearing the landscape, changed, but still recognizable. Colin signed the civil settlement agreement on September 22nd. Under its terms, he returned all documents related to the Marigold and the Astoria property, acknowledged the conduct clause violation, and formally gave up his inheritance rights under Dorothea's trust. In exchange, Russell Callahan. That is, I did not file criminal charges for the forged loan document or the attempted account access. Gerald walked me through the agreement plainly before I signed my portion. "He walks away with nothing from the estate," Gerald said, spreading the pages across his desk. "But he walks away without a fraud conviction on his record." "That's what I want," I said. Gerald looked at me over the document. Why I thought about it honestly before I answered. "Because destroying him completely doesn't bring Dorothea back," I said. "And because somewhere underneath everything he became, there's still a man I raised. I'm not protecting him. I'm leaving him a door." Gerald nodded slowly. Dorothea would have said the same thing. Renee's real estate license was suspended by the Oregon Real Estate Agency within 10 days of Petra Solis filing her referral. The financial crimes investigation broadened in October to include her conduct in both the Callahan matter and 2 of her earlier transactions. In November, Gage Tilford's attorney in San Diego and Brent Holloway's attorney in Seattle both reached out to Gerald, having read the Astoria news coverage, to discuss coordinated civil action. Gerald handled those calls with the quiet efficiency of a man who had been expecting them. That same week, Gerald filed a formal conduct complaint with the Oregon State Bar regarding Dorian Fitch's role in the manufactured petition. "It won't move fast," Gerald told me, "but it will move." I didn't follow every development closely. I left that to Gerald. I had a yard to run. October came in with its particular coastal light, lower and more golden than summer, the kind that makes everything look like a painting of itself. I repaired 3 boats, ordered winter supplies for the yard, had dinner with Pete twice a week, the way we always had. Life continued with the steady, humble insistence that it always does. But in quiet moments, I sat with something Gerald had said one morning in early October when we were closing out the last of the paperwork. "You know," Gerald said, refilling his coffee with the unhurried ease of a man with nothing urgent left to file, "most people in your position would have either confronted Colin the moment they suspected or crumbled under the pressure of not doing so." He looked at me evenly. "You did neither." You built a case. You gave him room to convict himself. A pause. That takes a particular kind of strength. I looked out his window at the Astoria street below. It also took 40 years of letting him off the hook every time he made a mistake. I said every debt I paid, every time I made excuses for choices he should have owned. My throat tightened. I'm not blameless in who he became, Gerald. I loved him in a way that didn't always serve him. Gerald looked at me for a long moment. That's the most honest thing I've heard anyone say in this office in 20 years. Dorothea knew the difference between love and wisdom, I said. I'm still learning it. December arrived with rain and the particular cold that rolls off the Pacific when the season has fully committed to itself. Colin had been gone from Astoria since late October. His charter business had filed for bankruptcy in November. The Portland apartment he and Renee had shared was vacated. Renee had moved somewhere in California. According to Gerald's contacts, Colin's whereabouts were less certain. He came to the dock on the 4th of December alone. No car I recognized. He walked down from the street in the rain with his collar up and his hands in his pockets, looking like a man who had traveled a considerable distance in more ways than one. He was thinner. The lines around his eyes were deeper. He stood at the top of the gangway and looked at the marigold, and then he looked at me. "I'm not here to ask for anything," he said immediately, and his voice had shed the rehearsed quality it had carried for years. What was left sounded tired and undefended, more like him than anything I had heard from my son in a long time. I just needed to see it. Her. He nodded toward the boat. And you. My chest tightened so fiercely it nearly took my breath. I kept my face steady. "How are you?" I asked. Honestly, he let out a short, unsteady breath. "I don't know yet. I'm trying to figure out who I am when I'm not drowning." He looked at the water. "I know I can't fix what I did, Dad. I know sorry isn't the right word for it. His jaw worked hard. His eyes went bright and wet. I keep seeing that photograph, the one Mom left in the engine compartment, that kid with a fishing rod." His voice broke completely on the next words. "I miss being that person. I miss not knowing what I was capable of becoming." My eyes burned so hard, I had to look up at the gray December sky for a moment. "That person is still in there somewhere," I said. "Whether you find him again is up to you." Colin nodded. He did not ask to come aboard. He didn't ask for forgiveness or money or a second chance. He stood in the rain for another moment, then turned and walked back up the dock toward the street. I watched him go until he rounded the corner and disappeared, and my heart broke quietly and completely for the boy I had taught to tie a bowline on this dock 35 years ago. Luca appeared from the yard behind me where he had been watching. "You okay, Grandpa?" he asked. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand, not bothering to hide it. "No," I said honestly. "But I will be." Luca stood beside me and we both looked at the empty street where Colin had been. A week after Colin walked away in the December rain, I woke before the alarm, 4:53 in the morning. The bedroom was dark and cold, the way only a house near the Pacific gets cold in winter. A damp, bone-deep chill that no amount of central heating fully resolves. I lay still for a moment, listening to the absence of sound which carries its own particular presence in a house where someone used to breathe beside you. Then I got up, dressed in the dark, made coffee in the thermos, and went down to the dock. The Marigold was waiting. She had come home from Gig Harbor in late September, delivered by a transport company Gerald had arranged. I had spent 3 October weekends going over every inch of her checking fasteners, inspecting seams, testing the engine with the focused attention of a man who needed to know that something he loved had come back undamaged. She had. Whatever Colin had or hadn't done with her in those 3 months, he had not harmed her. I chose to be grateful for that small mercy. I cast off the lines in the dark, moving by feel and memory. 40 years of the same dock, the same cleats, the same sequence of release. The engine turned over on the first try. That deep, familiar rumble rising up through the deck, planking into the soles of my boots. I eased the marigold out of her slip and pointed her bow toward the channel markers. Astoria Bay in December before dawn was a different world. The navigation lights along the channel blinked their patient red and green. The fishing fleet was still dark. A single light moved far out on the water, some commercial vessel heading south, indifferent to the hour. I let the throttle out to a slow cruise and followed the channel toward the open Pacific. Well, I said to the empty cockpit, to the dark water and the cold air and everything that wasn't there anymore. Here we are. I had been talking to Dorothea out loud since the day she died. I was not embarrassed by it. 42 years of telling her things at the breakfast table, on this boat, in the car, on long drives, did not stop because she was no longer in a position to answer. If anything, I had more to tell her now than I ever had before. The hearing is done, I said, guiding the boat through the last channel marker and into open water. Gerald says the Renee situation will take another year to fully resolve. Luca starts his second year at Oregon State in January. He called last week to ask if he could come down for Christmas. My chest warmed at that. I said yes, obviously. The Pacific opened up ahead of me, vast and dark and absolutely itself. I throttled back until the boat was barely moving, just enough way on to stay responsive to the helm, and I stood at the wheel in the pre-dawn quiet. I found your journal, I said. I read the entry about testing Colin, about him driving down from Portland that same afternoon with the paperwork. I kept my voice steady, even though my throat tightened on the words. You knew for months, Dorothea, you carried that alone while you were sick, while you were scared, while you were doing everything you could to hold on. My knuckles whitened briefly on the wheel. I wish you had told me. I know why you didn't, but I wish you had. The boat moved through the water with the soft, unhurried sound that wooden hulls make, a sound I had been hearing for 36 years. A sound as familiar as my own voice. I pressed my palm flat against the wheel's worn teak and felt the grain against my skin. You said you didn't protect the boat, I said. You protected the man who built his life around it. The pre-dawn air was cold enough to see my breath. I've been thinking about that, about what it means that a boat could be the thing that saves a person. I looked out at the dark water ahead. When you got sick, I kept working on her. When the trouble started after you were gone, fighting for her gave me something to stand up for. When I was sitting on this deck at midnight thinking about calling Colin and letting everything go, she was the reason I didn't. My voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. She kept me from disappearing into my own grief. She made me stay present, stay sharp, stay myself. I took a long breath of cold, salt air. You knew that. You've always known what I needed better than I did. The eastern sky had begun its slow negotiation, with the darkness not light yet. Just the first faint suggestion of it, a slightly less absolute darkness at the horizon's edge. I watched it come. In that quiet, I let myself be everything I had been over these 7 months: a grieving husband, a deceived father, a man who had been afraid and angry and close to broken, and had kept going anyway. A man who had learned at 69 that love and wisdom were not the same thing, and that it was possible to have too much of the first and not enough of the second. And something else. A man who had held on, who had done what his wife built the whole system trusting him to do, who had stood on a dock in Gig Harbor on a gray September morning with his hands steady and his head clear and finished what Dorothea had started. I was not the same man who had stood at St. Catherine's in his good shoes, listening to people tell him the funeral was beautiful. That man had still believed the world was essentially what it appeared to be. This man knew differently. This man had seen what people were capable of the worst, and in Pete and Claudette and Harriet and Luca, and even the reluctant Chet Pelham, something closer to the best. The light was building now pink at the edges, the water going from black to dark gray to something that held color. I opened the throttle slightly and let the marigold run. "I'm going to be all right," I told Dorothea, and meant it in a way I had not meant anything in a long time. Not today, maybe, but I'm going to be all right. When I brought the boat back into her slip an hour later and tied the dock lines with the easy, automatic movements of long practice, Luca was standing on the dock with 2 mugs of coffee. He had driven down from Corvallis the night before, said he wanted to be around for a while. He held 1 mug out as I stepped off the boat. "How was it?" he asked. I took the mug and wrapped both hands around it. The coffee was hot and strong and exactly right. "Good," I said. And then, because it was true and because he deserved the honest version, "She's still the best thing I ever put my hands on." Luca looked at the marigold in her slip, at the teak deck and the brass fittings and the salt-faded hull that held 36 years of everything that mattered. Then he looked at me with Dorothea's eyes in the early December light. "Can you teach me?" he asked. "Not just the engine, all of it. Everything you know about her." I looked at my grandson. I thought about a woman who had spent the last year of her life building a system of protection around a man who didn't know he needed it, who had sat across from lawyers and detectives and done every hard thing alone, quietly, without asking for credit, because that was simply who she was. I thought about what it means to be loved that carefully by another person, and how long it takes to understand the full weight of it. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out the old wrench I had carried since my commercial days, the one Dorothea had handed back to me, after every voyage, always in the same pocket, always returned. I held it out to Luca. He took it with both hands, the way you take something you understand the weight of. "We start tomorrow," I said. "Early." Luca wrapped his fingers around the wrench and smiled a full, unguarded morning smile. The kind that has nothing to do with anything except being exactly where you were supposed to be. We walked up from the dock together into the December morning, and behind us the marigold sat in her slip, patient and quiet, and entirely herself, waiting for whatever came next. That is where the story rests. The marigold back in her slip. Luca standing on the dock with 2 mugs of coffee. And me finally able to exhale after the longest 7 months of my life. What this cost me I am still counting. I lost my wife. I nearly lost my boat, my home, and what was left of my dignity. And I had to face the truth that the son I raised had become someone I did not fully recognize. I believe God kept me upright through that season, not by removing the pain, but by making sure I was never entirely alone in it. Dorothea had seen to that long before she left. Here is what I learned and what I want to leave with you. First, love someone well enough to plan ahead for the dangers they cannot yet see. Dorothea did that for me quietly without asking for any recognition. Second, if something feels wrong, do not confront, document. Emotion without evidence gives the other side room to deny everything. Third, the people who show up when it costs them something. A friend, a neighbor, a grandson standing in the rain. Those are the ones worth holding on to for the rest of your life. Fourth, do not let grief make you passive. The heaviest season of your life may also be the one that calls you to be the most clear-headed you have ever been. If this story moved you, I hope you will share it with someone who needs to hear it. A parent, a sibling, a friend, who is navigating something they cannot quite name. And if you have not yet subscribed to Father's Silent Revenge, I would be honored to have you. Leave a comment and tell me what stayed with you. I read them. Everyone. Thank you for sitting with me today. Take good care of yourself, and I will see you in the next story.